Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. The global economy is in dire straits. Well, that's an understatement. Some are saying the economy will recover in a U-shape, others say an L-shape, and yet others contend a V-shape. Reality is that we live in a world with completely new parameters. New landscapes, new industries, wiped out industries, and nothing but unknowns. So if we live in such a new world with new parameters, how can we apply old parameters to predict what's coming? We're in our last segment, and we have two major things to talk about here with my guest, Michael Czinkota. The first one, so we went a little bit around the globe in terms of where are interdependencies. So I know you mentioned before the biggest interdependency is probably pharmaceuticals. Now, when we think about pharmaceuticals, do we automatically think China because this is where the drugs are manufactured, or where are we on this?
Well, it helps to think a lot about China. It's certainly not the only option. There are other Latin American nations which produce many pharmaceutical products and products which are part of our own domestic scene, let's say automobile windows. But we also have lots of other Asian producers, take Vietnam, who are quite successful at producing new products, better products, which compete very successfully against US products.
So what do you think about US-China relations? Coming back to US-China, now we have a big election year, obviously. How would you expect or anticipate our relationships between Washington and Beijing going to be affected going forward?
Well, that's a tough one, and we have experienced in the past years opportunities and attempts to make directions possible, but keep in mind that China has developed its own capabilities, its own directions, its own strategies. China is not anymore, as it used to be for a long time, responsive to what the US is doing, but China is doing its own thing, and it's doing so quite successfully. And very often we in the US are way too slow in anticipation, in making things happen on our end. I'll give you one example which really got me all charged up. In 1890, there was a meeting of the International Postmasters Union. Everybody who was a postmaster in charge of stamps and shipping got together there, and the US went there, and China also went there. Remember, 1894. And China made an appeal that it was a underdeveloped nation, that it didn't have enough money, and it really wanted to participate in trade. Everybody understood and nodded and wanted to be helpful, and therefore developed a new category of cost of shipping for China especially. And the idea was that Chinese cost of shipping to the United States would be kept at 20% of regular cost of shipping. Now that seems reasonable. You're helping a poor country. Guess what? As I looked at the data for 2000 and 2010, I investigated how much did China pay for its shipment of goods to the United States. And lo and behold, they were still operating under the same agreement from 1894, sorry.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, you have to stop and say, somehow this is not right. Why should Chinese be able to ship at much lower rates than US companies?
Yeah.
Especially under conditions where China's participation in world trade is much more active and much more successful than ever before. So I sat down and wrote an editorial about that. And within days, I received more than 3,000 letters and comments of people saying, you're right, this should no longer be the case.
But has it been
And
changed
I'm happy
since then?
to report that the president of this fine country decided to have the U.S. leave the International Postmasters Union without continuing this preferential treatment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, in terms of global trade, having this being an election year and this being an election year like none other before, so to speak, let's talk a little bit about different scenarios in how the global economy or global trade is likely going to be affected. So depending on who the winner of the election is. So what happens if, for example, Biden wins? Can we anticipate major shifts in the global economy and in global trade?
Well, it depends how one interprets the need for action and how one learns to take action. And if you look at our two candidates, one has to conclude that at least at this stage, President Trump has a much better understanding for steps to take to right wrongs, to speak, especially with China, than many other people. And I would expect that a Trump win, would allow for a clearer, better, neater transition than a Biden win. But these are very narrow examples, because we have to understand that over the next 4 years, of course, new issues will emerge and will need to be taken into account. And on my end, I must say that it's very likely that these new issues can be better handled by the establishment of groups, advisors, counselors, which can help make a difference rather than being intimidated by the strength and push-up capability of China.
So clearly there is a need to make a stand, as it sounds like. That's for sure. So, okay, so we talked a little bit about what happens if Trump wins or what happens if Biden wins. But in respect to China, are there, in terms of the global economy, are there any major shifts? For example, we have Brexit in England going on. So are there any major shifts that would impact or would be impacted by whoever the winner is?
Well, China has made a lot of investments and
everywhere
has demonstrated that it is willing and interested in participating directly with other countries and their plans and activities. This is particularly noteworthy in places like Africa. It is also visible in Latin America. And I would expect that China would be willing to hold itself out as collaborator of Brexit nation results within Britain, because there's the feeling that China can be perhaps more helpful than the EU would be for Britain alone.
Okay, so countries can go directly to the various different players. Now, we're almost out of time, but there's one scenario that we haven't talked about this, and that could be, so what happens if we do not have a declared winner until January?
Well, quite candidly, on a personal level, I hope that is not the case, because it's simply too open-ended and too risk-bearing.
But on a global economy, what would happen? And it has to be quick.
With a global economy, I think there are not that many current issues outstanding which we immediately have to clamp down on and repair or refashion.